So YouTube has kept trying to suppress these videos. They keep giving me strikes. So I'm not going to say what I usually say at the beginning of today's episode, but if something happens to me in the near future, you know who did it. This show is about facts. So if you want to see the facts and the resources that we use to create this script, you can go to the resources document, which is in the description of this show. And on top of that, all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. With that said, this is a really disturbing episode, but one people need to hear. Let's get into it, and welcome to the Conspiracy Files. For years, I've been talking about how big of a problem pedophilia is in society today. It's insane how many different people have gotten away with crimes against children over the years. I think as a society and a culture, we're now awakening to the horrible, horrific things that have happened right under our noses for decades, centuries. And there is a desire to expose these truths and to put a spotlight on these creeps, because these predators, these pedophiles, are hiding under the rocks. They're snakes in the bushes waiting for children to walk through that they can, jump out and strike. And I think we're doing a good thing here by bringing these stories to you guys so you can educate yourselves, because all these stories that we cover here on the show, these are not stories that you're going to find in textbooks. These aren't stories you're even going to find about in newspapers. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but they're also stories that they don't make true crime documentaries about and podcasts don't talk about. These are the shadowy underground networks that have been kept quiet, or been sealed. I don't even know how to phrase that terminology wise, but these are networks and people that operated above the law, a lot of times with the governments of their respected countries, catering to wealthier, more elite members of society. And then you have this Snuff film thing. I can't tell you how many times I've posted about cases involving Snuff films, or I've talked to people about them, and it goes back to these articles. There's apparently this big article that was released years ago that says the government's never found proof of one Snuff film ever. Well, what about ISIS? What about the cartel? What about murderers, serial killers that recorded their murders? Those are all Snuff films. There's no way that there's not one, especially in this case. Today we're talking about a guy that was producing Snuff films for clients. And there's still a subset of people who believe that that's just some sort of a lie. That I don't know if they don't want to dig that deep to discover that humanity can be that dark, or if they're just sheep, believing what the government and Snopes.com tells them. It is really bizarre. Speaking of Snuff films and all of that, today we're talking about Warwick Spinx, one of the most despicable motherfuckers to ever walk the face of the earth. Today's script and research was done in part by Rebecca Whitworth. Thank you, Rebecca. Everyone give her some love in the comments. Let's dig into it. According to the CEOP-managed Missing Kids website, the UK reports a child is missing every 3 minutes, which is upwards of 140,000 children who are reported missing each year. Additionally, child sexual exploitation is linked to many different types of missing incidents, such as children running away from home, being forced to leave home or care, or being trafficked into, out of, and within the UK. There's also, on top of that, being abducted and kidnapped. Evidence suggests that attention needs to be paid to the quality of relationships with caregivers across different types of caring environments, and addressing the pull factors used by exploiters. Repeated missing incidents indicate a higher level of vulnerability to child exploitation. In fact, the window in which a young person returns from one of these events is integral to the investigation and allows for better understanding of the levels of risk and harm, especially to those in repeated incidents. Children over 16 years of age are just as vulnerable to sexual exploitation in the way that those under 16 are. They often lack access to accommodation and financial resources when they run away, but are less likely to be recognized as in need of protection due to their age and professional perception around consent. Child sexual exploitation and missing incidents can be linked to other issues as well, such as forced marriage, a disturbing rabbit hole there. And finally, victims of child exploitation may need to go missing in order to escape their exploiters. Yet there is little support available that supports those young people who seek to exert control over their own situation. For example, safe specialist accommodations to flee to. So there aren't really resources available for kids when they do escape from these exploitation rings and these rings. Where do they go? Who takes care of them? Who helps them out? Criminally underfunded category of society. In 1997 alone, the United Kingdom's police force estimated that there were at least 25,000 active pedophiles in Britain alone. It's no surprise that these cases of missing children are tied to way bigger issues, namely pedophile rings. hidden in different facets of many, many different countries, in which most of the general public are generally unaware of. But every once in a while, this information is brought forth very publicly to shed light on the happenings beyond this large number of missing children, the inside secrets that many still turn a blind eye to. On April 8, 1997, in a Granada Studios TV documentary called The Boy Business, a man known as Edward came forward to the Scotland Yard, in which he made allegations against a British man, a man named Warwick Spinx, and claimed that he was involved in a massive child pornography or CSAM ring located in Amsterdam that produced snuff films in which young boys were sexually abused and murdered on camera. But this wasn't the beginning. The story actually started long before that. I just want to preface this one more time, listener and viewer. Warning, this is an incredibly dark, disturbing, and graphic tale. So if you don't want to dive into this, I completely understand, but this is really necessary, and I want to warn you before we get into this. We are going to be discussing all sorts of abuse, graphic details of murders. This story is one that sticks with you, because we have to start out with the Bjorn tape. The first time the Amsterdam Vice Police came across the Bjorn tape was in July 1991, when it was intercepted by a customs officer. This tape had been sent from Denmark, and the sender refused to speak about the tape's origin. The tape recorded the relentless sexual assaults of a Dutch boy who was carried in front of the camera, limp, before being strapped into a chair, where he was defenseless against the indulgences of his two pedophile attackers. The video footage showed this young boy named Bjorn, age 9 or 10, being carried into a nondescript room by a man with a blanket over his head. The child was then tied to a chair and ordered to carry out sexual acts on the man standing next to him in the footage. There follows a long sequence where Bjorn is seriously sexually abused by the two men. Sometimes the boy's pain is clearly audible. You can hear him screaming in the tape. His voice is scared, and he tells the men to stop. It also should be noted that Bjorn, the young boy, appears to have been drugged, as he's limp and looks kind of dazed out. During the filming of this tape, the men go to some lengths to avoid recognition, but the room in which the filming takes place is never fully shown. The film was made to be sold. It was made to generate a profit, and one of the men says clearly on the footage, "This film is going to make us a lot of money." 3 months after the first Bjorn tape was intercepted, a French man was arrested while he was trying to get child pornography of his own developed. A copy of this Bjorn tape was found in that pedophile's hotel room, and he stated that he had borrowed it from an Englishman named John. So, in January 1993, the Amsterdam Vice Police arrested a Swiss national who was suspected of the kidnapping and possible murder of several children. This Swiss national also turned out to be in possession of a copy of the Bjorn tape, as were a number of other child abusers who came to the police's attention in the 1990s. After this thing was made, police who were arresting pedophiles and working on rescuing children from these sexual exploitation rings, these officers kept finding this disturbing tape. It was like a collector's item to pedophiles. This was like the cream of the crop stuff for them. At the end of 1996, Dutch police searched an apartment on an Amsterdam canal. That apartment was then occupied by a local man who, together with his Belgian girlfriend, had sexually abused two 8 and 11-year-old boys from Thailand and made a videotape of their own documenting this sexual abuse. During the search, a suitcase full of videotapes of child pornography was recovered, and it was stated that these were probably the original Bjorn tapes. In 1997, continuing detective work revealed that a boy called Bjorn had reported a crime of sexual abuse against his stepbrother, Richard, and his friend, John. These crimes had occurred in or around 1990 in an apartment in the east of the Netherlands. The apartment in question was located and searched by authorities, and it was indeed determined to be the location where the tape had been made. They were able to match the room to what they saw in that horrific footage. Richard, Bjorn's brother, was then arrested. And how much prison time do you think he got for filming that abuse and selling it to pedophiles? How much? Don't forget the abuse as well. 2 years of imprisonment. Richard, for making that tape, was sentenced to 2 years. John, his friend who was also on camera assaulting Bjorn, had gone to Thailand many years earlier, but was arrested at the Heathrow airport in London when he made a trip home in August of 1998. He was a wanted man, and he received a sentence of 6 years in prison. The Dutch police eventually traced Bjorn's accent to an area in the north of Holland, where they combed through files of reported child abuse and found him. You see, Bjorn had contacted authorities, like we said, a year earlier to complain that a Dutch man, whom he had named, had been drugging and raping him since he was only 3 years old, most recently with the assistance of an Englishman. The Dutchman had been tried and, in the absence of the video, had been acquitted for his crimes against Bjorn. This Dutchman then sued Bjorn for making malicious complaints against him, which sent Bjorn into a mental collapse where he would eventually find refuge in an orphanage. And now we get to the man in question, Warwick Spinx. In the late 1980s, when he was 22 years old, Edward moved from Birmingham to Amsterdam to take advantage of its more liberal attitudes towards homosexuality. While in Amsterdam, Edward met a British man, a British pedophile named Warwick Spinx, who gave the impression to many he met that he was a very magnetic character and a former friend of Edward's. Now, Edward, this random man that we're now talking about, was a former acquaintance of Warwick's. He'd known him for a while. Now, Edward and Warwick ended up becoming very good friends. They both got deep into the pedophile community in Amsterdam, and at one point, when speaking with authorities, Edward related a very vivid memory to them in which he met Warwick Spinx, this man in question, in the center of Amsterdam, and Warwick was accompanied by a young boy. This was out in public, and this young boy was being gripped tightly by the arm by Warwick. This boy was a typical Dutch-looking boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. According to Edward, at the time, Warwick glanced down at the boy and said, "I've got a delivery. I'm going to be another half an hour." And afterwards, when Warwick left with the boy, Edward claimed that he never saw that boy again. Detective Bob McLaughlin said that Warwick was very adept at identifying vulnerable children, and he frequently visited railway stations, streets in London, and was always on the hunt for children that he could abuse. According to the detective, when Warwick would identify the child he wanted to abuse, he'd convince the kid that it was in his best interest to get to know him. He was preying on these underprivileged youths, these homeless youths on the street. "Hey, if you're friends with me, I can set you up with a place, I can get you food, I can get you paid." But they had no idea what they were signing up for. When Edward met Warwick Spinx, the friendly Londoner was working as a barman and a pimp in a brothel in Amsterdam called the Gay Place. Upstairs in this bar was a gay brothel, in which Warwick's job was to basically pimp the prostitutes upstairs and also encourage other prostitutes to join their roster. He was like a bouncer-pimp combination. The Boy Business documentary went on to say that areas like fast food restaurants, the Piccadilly Circus, and video game areas were popular places for men to hunt down these vulnerable children. Edward, on the video, said that Warwick would often go to London or Munich or Berlin and approach and then offer the boys something they needed at that time. Whatever they needed, whether it was a roof over their head or security or money or drugs, or even just 2 meals a day. And that's how he would find and identify these victims. In November of 1992, 17-year-old Kenny was homeless, broke, and addicted to drugs, and he was the perfect target for Warwick. Kenny said he didn't know Warwick was gay until the following night after he met him, when he was in the pubs with him and saw the way he was getting on with people around him. Warwick then persuaded Kenny, who was 17 and broke at the time, to travel with him to a private gay club. In the Guardian article, "The Sheer Scale of Child Sex Abuse in Britain," the author states, "Spinx is a pedophile of grandiose ambition, a man who has commercialized his obsession, first by running an agency in Britain which sold boys to like-minded punters, and then by moving to Amsterdam, where, as the Guardian disclosed, he worked in brothels and joined a group of British men who produced videos, in which 5 boys were alleged to have been raped and murdered for the pleasure of viewers." Now, Warwick was eventually arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. This was for his crime of abducting and raping 2 homeless minors in London. Spinx was transferred from prison to a probation hostel in South London, where he was asked to fill in a form so that the police could enter his details onto the, at the time, new registry of sex offenders. Warwick is precisely the kind of compulsive offender for whom the registry was designed, so that police could keep an eye on their movements. Warwick, however, refused to fill in the form. He simply walked out of the hostel and sent his probation officer a postcard with an invitation to come see him in Amsterdam. Since then, it's known that he's traveled to Frankfurt, Johannesburg, Moscow, and Prague, pursuing his own special interests, with never a care for the sex offenders registry or any other limb of the child protection system. He escaped. So they gave him a short sentence for sexually abusing 2 minors. He walked out of the building he was supposed to be in, sent his probation officer a postcard, and was able to travel through Europe for decades, raping and abusing children. But this would sort of start to change with the Boy Business documentary. Melanie McFadyen and Nick Davies, both British investigative journalists, researched and published the documentary The Boy Business in 1997 through Granada Television Studios. The documentary itself was about British pedophiles who prey on homeless and vulnerable children, and the documentary worked to confront the men who trade in child pornography, investigate the recruitment of young boys, and they also wanted to talk to the victims and relatives of those who were affected by this thing. The film predominantly featured that man, Edward, who claimed that films had been made in Amsterdam in which young boys were abused and killed on camera. And it also featured that convicted pedophile, Warwick Spinx, and those allegations stated that Warwick Spinx, that convicted pedophile, was involved in producing these films. Films, if you don't know, are pornographic films that climax with real murders on camera. But police in the pedophilia unit in New Scotland Yard say there was no evidence that films exist, though there were many in which boys are sexually abused, notably the Bjorn tape as we discussed at the beginning. However, the police at the time stated that that doesn't mean that there aren't people capable out there of doing such a sadistic act. They just said they didn't believe that these films that Warwick Spinx were producing existed. Edward in the documentary claimed that it's easier for people to dismiss this as being a fable, to not even believe that crimes against young children like this happen, rather than believe they are real. That would legitimize and make these nightmares real. The Boy Business film begins by showcasing the pedophilia unit in the UK, made up of 15 officers whose full-time jobs were to catch the pedophiles and identify their victims. While this team was active, they examined thousands of tapes that were recovered during these arrests, since pedophiles are known to hide obscene material on innocent recordings. A lot of things that child predators used to do is they'd get like a VHS of, I don't know, like The Little Mermaid, and they'd let the first 10 minutes of the movie play, and then like 10 minutes in, it would cut to their homemade or whatever purchased child abuse material. Detective Inspector Bob McLaughlin of the pedophilia unit of the New Scotland Yard mentions in the documentary that actual child pornography is not like what one would imagine. These are films that contain serious sexual crimes against children with no production value. Homemade tapes of terror and torture. Sergeant Steve Edwards also said that the Piccadilly Circus in London was a popular spot for pedophiles to find male prostitutes and young men. These pedophiles would sit in the windows of the fast food places in the area, or the coffee shops, or hang on the railings on the lookout for victims. Edwards said he's constantly on the lookout for young homeless boys who end up selling themselves as male prostitutes. They call them rent boys. Coming shortly after the highly publicized prosecution of the Sydney Cook gang, we're going to talk about that in a moment, the broadcast of The Boy Business ignited public outrage and spread fear about a growing industry of child abduction for child snuff films. Amsterdam took pride in being a tolerant city when it came to attitudes towards LGBTQ+ people, but claims of children being murdered on camera took child pornography and the concept of it to an extreme new level. Additionally, all kinds of British men who were attracted to children and the criminals who profited from this obsession congregated there in Amsterdam. I don't know why there's an absolutely massive amount of pedophiles in Amsterdam. Just look it up today. I think it's like somewhere between 40 to 60% of all child pornography hosted on the internet nowadays, 2024, is hosted in Amsterdam. It's like still to this day a child abuse hotspot of a country. And this whole affair is unfolding there. In the film, Detective McLaughlin stated that there was a long-held suspicion that boys were being encouraged to leave London to go work in the brothels in Amsterdam that existed there in 1991. He went on to say that a number of information sources approached them, the police force I mean, telling them that it was happening and that it involved men from the United Kingdom. Edward, the guy involved in all of this, went on to say that he had only learned about Warwick Spinx after he had broken away from the scene in Amsterdam. Warwick himself apparently had come up with the idea of having boats just outside of Amsterdam, and they would use these boats to traffic children in and out of the UK, in and out of Amsterdam, and all around Europe. Warwick even claimed that once they had a child on the boat, they'd be able to do whatever they wanted to them. Now, like I said before, Warwick Spinx would particularly go to areas where runaways and homeless children congregated, and that's where he would hunt his victims. Typically, he would find kids in the UK, in the Piccadilly Circus area, around London, poor, underprivileged youths, and he would convince them that he could change their life, he could get them money. He acted, obviously kind and very sweet to them. And then he would get them on these boats or trains or however he would transport the children, bring them to Amsterdam. And once they were there, nobody even knew these kids were in the country. So they were essentially his slaves that he could keep, as we're going to talk about, and sell to other people. In a 2012 Mirror article by author Keir Moody, the article states that an undercover officer found Spinx in Amsterdam. And on a hidden camera recording, Spinx can be heard offering to supply the officer a video in which a 10-year-old boy was murdered on camera. The undercover officer also received a tip-off from a man named Frank, who told him of a trip to Amsterdam where Frank met Spinx. Frank claimed that Warwick wanted to sell him special films, and showed him a sample of these films involving a boy being beaten, castrated, and cut open on camera. The officer asked Warwick when he finally caught up to him if he could get him torture videos featuring 10-year-old boys, and Warwick Spinx replied saying, "I know. Well, I knew some people who were involved. They only sold them in limited editions, made 10 copies or something. 10 very rich customers in America who pay $5,000 each." But eventually, on one of his trips back to the United Kingdom from Amsterdam, Warwick was, like we said, arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for selling a 14-year-old British boy in a Dutch brothel, a boy named Gary. But Warwick's sentence was short-lived. And now we get to some connected people and victims of Warwick Spinx. Like we talked about before, in November of 1992, 17-year-old Kenny was homeless, broke, and using drugs, and he was the perfect target for Warwick Spinx. Kenny said that he didn't know Warwick was gay until the following night when he was in the pubs and he witnessed Warwick's behavior. At that point, Warwick persuaded Kenny to travel with him to a private gay club in Amsterdam. Kenny said later on that Warwick got a book out when they were in this club, and that book contained 15 to 20 photographs of young naked boys, aged 9 to 13, showing off their penises, and that Warwick obviously enjoyed it. Kenny went on to say that the boys looked various ways. Some looked incredibly scared, some looked like they were drugged up, some weren't smiling, some even looked happy, but most of them weren't. And that's what gave him an incredibly bad vibe. There were no words written in the book, apart from under one single photograph, there was a word, virgin. Now, as time went on, Kenny ended up owing Warwick Spinx hundreds of pounds, and when he couldn't pay him back, Warwick suggested an alternative. He said he could get young boys for him, and Kenny knew why he wanted this, so that Warwick could produce child pornography. Kenny refused, saying that he would pay him in installments, but Warwick started to get violent and angry, pushed him, and started maniacally laughing before him that night. Kenny also asked Warwick what he got out of these child pornography films, and Warwick told him that he liked to see boys bleed, cry, and experience pain because it got him off or caused him to orgasm. Kenny, though, still refused to help Warwick and eventually managed to break away and escape. Later in the Boy Business documentary, Kenny reiterates that he thought Warwick Spinx was disgusting, saying that he's put a lot of people through a lot of pain, and that he just doesn't care about the consequences. He doesn't think about that. He just wants the boys. He just wants the money. And if Warwick doesn't have someone traffic him a boy, he'll go out and get one himself. Gary was just 14 years old when he met Warwick Spinx. He and a friend had run away from a children's home in England and were living on the streets in London when Warwick found them. Gary said that he and his friend had been living on the streets for a couple of nights in the cold with nothing to eat, and they were sitting against a wall when Warwick approached them. Gary and his friend thought that Warwick was genuine and went with him to get a bed and food, and traveled to his flat in Hastings. But when they got there, Warwick pulled out a knife and told the two boys to take their clothes off and do sexual acts with each other while he took photos. And after Warwick forced these children to rape each other at knife point on camera, he then sexually abused them. When asked why he was taking pictures, Gary stated that Warwick told him he's a and he wanted to send the photos off to his people and places in Amsterdam to make some money. Now, Gary was frightened, but he was desperate, and he ended up staying with Warwick Spinx for a little while, and eventually he became hooked on drugs and fell fully under Warwick's control. Eventually, Gary and his friend were taken out of the country of England to Amsterdam to pick up some drugs, but Warwick sold them while they were there to a brothel called the Blue Boy, a notorious brothel in the heart of Amsterdam. Gary later said that he was abused hundreds of times there, and that the landlord who owned the brothel would supply the children with drugs, willingly or not, in their drinks until they were, quote, like zombies and couldn't move. Then people could do what they wanted to them without the children fighting back. Gary was actually the reason that Warwick eventually ended up in prison, because Warwick had brought him to the Netherlands and sold him into sexual slavery. Gary said that, quote, "I'll never forget him. He's f***ed up his life completely. He's damaged me inside, and a lot of other people he's done it to as well." Then there's Peter Howls, The Grenada investigation, that documentary The Boy Business in 1997, covered the original manhunt for the makers of the notorious Bjorn tape and traced the story of Peter Howls, the former manager of London-based Bover Boots casting agency. Peter also operated from Amsterdam, and his agency was used as a cover for nearly 20 years for the production of obscene photographs of children, with several survivors recounting stories of signing up to be models with this agency and then being sent by the agency to be photographed and manipulated into posing for sexual images that were then shared to international pedophile networks. These children were tempted by the offer of TV work. I mean, what couldn't you love when you were that young? Your parents are trying to break you into the entertainment industry. Here's a guy that's saying, we can get you on TV, we can put you in movies. You just have to show up here. Then all of a sudden, these people that you don't know without your parents there are pressuring you to do this and that. And that's how they work on people, and they groom them and they cultivate victims. Through this process, children as young as 8 years old would visit the home of who they thought was the official photographer of the agency, a man named Harry Jeffries. Matthew, one of Peter's victims, claimed that he was about 10 or 11 when he first met him, and that Peter was in his 40s by then, and there was a night when Peter tried to put his arm around him and attempted to slide his hand into his pajama bottoms. Now, Matthew said that he pushed Peter away, but then Peter went on to tell his photographer, Harry Jeffries, what had happened between he and Matthew, and stated that Jeffrey, hearing this, instead of trying to help save the child, just started laughing and said, "You're mine. He messed up by trying to touch you." It was all a game to them. In the late 1980s, Peter, the head of that casting agency, decided to leave England and open a new office in Amsterdam. Detective Inspector Ian Delbert recalled one incident in which he heard that Peter Howls was assaulted, and when the Dutch police went to render him assistance, they found numerous photographs all over his houseboat, with children photographed in indecent poses. They also said that the difference in the laws between their two countries made it difficult for the Dutch police to actually do anything about this, and nothing ever came of it. The Grenada documentary crew were actually able to find and catch up with Peter by tempting him with an offer for his casting agency. And once they got him on camera, they asked him how many boys he and the other men had sexually abused at the home of Jeffries, to which he said none, and who's Harry Jeffries? The filmmakers went on to say that numerous victims and parents had said that Peter's casting agency had something to do with taking indecent photographs of boys. And Peter said on camera, "Well, it's nothing to do with me." They then continued by saying, "You were named in statements to police saying you sexually abused boys." To which Peter said, "I haven't." The Grenada crew then asked if Peter had any sexual interest in boys or if he was a pedophile, and obviously Peter denied both. Finally, the crew asked about the Dutch police incident in which they had found indecent photographs of children lining the walls of his houseboat, and Peter stated there wasn't and they haven't. Peter, again in the interview, emphasized that he had no sexual interest in young boys. The documentary then went on to explain that in fact, Peter had indecently assaulted a 9-year-old British boy more than 25 years ago in Amsterdam, and that Peter Howls was an acquaintance of one more serious pedophile. He was linked through this in paperwork and was known to be a friend of his, none other than Warwick Spinx. Edward, that other pedophile that was speaking to the documentary filmmakers, recalled an incident in which he was having lunch with both Peter and Warwick, and that at the table at the restaurant, there was a 9-year-old boy with his parents behind them. Peter couldn't take his eyes off of the child and kept saying, "I bet he would be good in bed," or "I bet I could teach him a few things," or "I bet he's got a lovely body." It was very clear to everyone that surrounded him what kind of a man Peter Howls was. But Peter Howls had nothing to do with the prostitution or the pornographic business set up by Warwick Spinx. Harry Jeffries is another twisted pedophile that now we have to talk about. Remember, Harry is the photographer for Peter's agency. Lee, one of the victims here, claimed that Harry Jeffries was like an uncle to him, and that everything they would do together was stuff they couldn't do anywhere else. Harry would apparently go so far as to offer to take the victims back to their front doorsteps and to explain to their parents who he was and why he was late bringing their kids home. Kathy, Lee's mother, recalled a time when she had met Harry for the second time, and he offered her his coat, and she had even gone so far as to visit Harry's apartment herself, yet she had no idea what was going on in there. It seemed that Harry had cleaned up before she had arrived. They really had no reason, none of these parents or children, to think that Harry or his friends would cause any danger, and that was all part of Harry's plan. This was a part of the manipulation and the grooming. You see, Harry would pick his victims, he would shower the children with praise, love, and gifts. He would go over to the parents of these victims' houses, he would schmooze them, he would make them feel comfortable, And then after making the parents comfortable, Harry would ask the children to come in for a more private, unaccompanied photo session. The children, once they were at this private session, were then told by Harry that a man he worked with, James Chalkley, had a small role in the popular TV soap EastEnders. Now, this is an interesting note. James Chalkley, that man who Harry would tell the story about, he ended up heading to Amsterdam to live with his brother. But in 2013, James Chalkley and his brother's bodies were found in their apartment with plastic bags over their heads and tape on their mouths. And the police didn't rule out murder, but they've never arrested any suspects in their deaths. Now, Lee, the victim, went on to say that he thought it was a great opportunity for him working with Harry to get into EastEnders, so he thought this was innocent when Harry asked him to come into a session wearing swimming trunks, and that there was nothing wrong with that. But then, once he was there in the photo studio without his parents, Harry asked Lee to pull his trunks down just a little bit, to expose just a little, and that's when he started to worry. Now, when Harry and these photographers would get these children into these positions where they're almost exposing themselves, they would pull out an old trick and say something along the lines of, well, right, at this point we need to rub baby oil on you because it enhances the picture that we're taking. And initially, Harry and these other photographers would have the boys rub the baby oil on themselves, but it would eventually get to the point where the photographers would say, "You missed a spot," and rub the oil on them for them, and would then ask them to roll down their pants until it virtually became nothing that they were wearing. Lee, the victim, claimed that Harry got more aggressive as time went on in this session and following sessions. More aggressive in how he would talk to the victims and berate them into taking lewd photos. And if you ever refused, like Lee had at one point when he turned 14, Harry or the other photographers would tell the victims, "If you don't do it, I'll tell your parents about these photos and everyone will see them," and basically gaslighted them. "No one would believe that I photographed you naked," he would say, followed by, "I will send these photographs around these estates to all your friends and they will laugh at you." It wasn't until one of the victims, Matthew, went to the police that people realized what was really going on. Matthew was just 9 years old when he was first photographed by Harry. Matthew said that Harry would call him names and threaten him. He stated that he would have him blacklisted from the film industry, or that he'd show the nude photographs that he had of him to his friends and family to try and mentally torture them. Matthew, the victim, also went on to say that Harry's bedroom had a hole in the door that people could look through, along with hidden air vents and false walls with a cupboard behind it for the camera equipment. After 5 years of being repeatedly abused by Harry, Matthew broke the wall of silence by heading to the police. And finally, that opened up the can of worms and more children came forward. Finally, the police raided Harry Jeffries' home and they found negatives and photographs hidden behind literally everything in the apartment. The place was filled literally floor to ceiling with child pornography. Kathy, victim Lee's mother, reported that she got a knock on her door one day, and when she opened it up, there was a policeman there who interviewed her and later asked if some of the naked photos he was in possession of were of her son Lee. Lee, upon seeing this and learning that this secret was out, was mortified and broke down and could barely even look at his mom or brother in the eyes. Eventually, Harry Jeffries, that was convicted and served 1 year of a 2-year sentence for taking indecent photographs of children, and then he was released. In a secret conversation that was eventually recorded of him, Harry Jeffries still to this day denies any wrongdoing. This is a quote from him. He said, "You know how we have dealt with, all fitted up. Look, I'm an artist, right? I take new photographs. Don't you realize what I've been through? And yet you come here and stir it all up." That is a direct quote from him. The Granada documentary went on to say that Harry Jeffries refused an interview with their team, and when they returned to his home, they found Mr. Jeffries and another man once again in the company of a young boy. The boy claimed to the camera crew that they were only taking photos of him outside. I mean, this is insane footage. You have to watch this documentary. This documentary crew rolls up to Harry Jeffries' house, and he's there with another man and a young boy. Literally, they catch him at the moment trying to prey on another child. And because of this footage and the subsequent police report, local authorities ended up opening a new investigation into Harry. But behind the orchestration of all of this, all of the terrible things that were happening, was that man named Peter Howls. Peter was the one pulling the strings behind Harry, and Peter was the one working with Warwick Spinks. In the final part of the Granada documentary, Edward claims that he saw 5 films in which 5 different men abuse children, torture them, and then murder them on camera. But to this day, no one has found any physical evidence to prove that those murders were committed on tape. Edward recalls one of the films in which one of the boys were on a boat with Warwick. Edward said, quote, "He was able to do anything that he wanted to do to the boy. Things got out of hand, and the boy ended up dying, which was recorded on a video camera." end quote. The interviewer then asked, how did the boy die? Edward then stated, he suffocated on the genitals of the man, and what happened after the boy had apparently suffocated on the tape, there was panic. There was a lot of running in and out. The camera got hit from the side and blanked out. But the whole thing was, it was inevitable that this was actually going to happen. There was sound on the camera. You could hear the waves sapping against the side of the boat. You could hear noises of waterfowl in the background. You could hear the boy gagging. You could hear the man grunting. When the boy actually died, you could hear the panic in the man's voice. Edward himself had no criminal record, and he was not paid by the Granada film crew to tell his story. But after talking to the crew for the documentary, he was interviewed by both the British and the Dutch police and offered to work with them to prove what he said was true. Eventually, the Dutch police launched a formal inquiry into Edward's allegations, because they believed Edward had to be taken seriously because he was pointing a finger at a man with a long and lengthy track record of appalling sexual violence towards young boys, Warwick Spinx. After this, Warwick was placed under surveillance by Scotland Yard precisely because of the information received that he was selling tapes of children being tortured and killed. In a remarkable and revealing conversation, when he didn't know he was being secretly recorded by undercover officers in Holland, Warwick Spinx, on camera, boasted of his knowledge of snuff movies. He said, quote, I know somebody who was in a snuff movie, and somebody got snuffed in front of him. He was from Birmingham, middle 20s. I know the person who made the film. I felt sorry for this boy. It was a German boy, about 13 to 15. He thought he was going to make 200 guilders and ended up being dead. I know I'm a fat old queen, but I get away with murder, end quote. In the film, Detective McLaughlin, who we talked about before, stated that rumors of the existence of what are known as snuff movies have been around for a very long time. Law enforcement officers have never found one of these. However, it is very fair to say that in my experience, we've witnessed video films of horrendous abuse of children arriving at a point where they are tortured from prison. From prison, Warwick Spinx denied all of his crimes, saying, I had 3 brothels in Amsterdam, but that does not make me an associate murderer. It does not mean that I'm in a ring, because I've never had anything to do with anything like that. But in the Boy Business documentary, Edward, a close friend of Warwick's and a pedophile himself, insists that not only was Warwick involved in the systematic abuse of children, that he was also involved in their murders. At the request of the documentary staff, Edward helped the Dutch police find the house in the suburb of Amsterdam, where he claimed he was shown videos of young boys being murdered, as well as the lake where the man he met at the house allegedly disposed of the bodies. The interviewer said at the scale in which Warwick was funneling boys into this pedophile ring, surely someone would have noticed something. And Edward makes the point to mention that the boys were homeless and incredibly vulnerable children, not necessarily kids that captured the public eye. Edward described the 5 boys, saying that one had brown hair, 2 were blonde, 1 was a strawberry blonde, and the 5th had a very distinctive haircut. The interview asked if the children spoke on the tapes, and Edward said they cried and screamed in languages he didn't understand. When working with him, the Dutch police worked to get detailed information from Edward, and it was discovered that many had gone to the British police with information that Warwick was a possible supplier of films. British Customs confirmed to the Granada film crew that Edward had first offered the story to them in 1991, but no one believed him. Given the sort of abuse the police saw on tapes they had seized, they did agree that it was possible the children may have been killed on camera. Detective Bailey of the Scotland Yard said that, short of actually injuring this child and him dying, I don't think there's anything else they can do to him that's so horrific, and the boys obviously could point the finger at their abuser if he had eventually been found, as a reason why these films might have existed. Edward claimed that he was speaking out now because he could no longer live with his failure to act when he first saw Warwick leading off a young boy in the center of Amsterdam. At the end of the Boy Business documentary, Edward is found dwelling over his mistakes. Edward says, quote, I saw 5 children killed, and it was organized and orchestrated by Warwick and his associates. I had no control over the boys that were killed on the tapes. That there was nothing I could do other than try and bring it to the attention of the authorities when I was back in England. But I did see Warwick with the boy outside the gay palace, and I didn't do anything about it at the time, and I don't know how he worked out. The interviewer then asked, what do you think happened to that boy? And Edward stated, I don't know. I think that Warwick is a very evil man, and anything could have happened to that boy. I'm with what I know. Now what about Warwick? I should have done more, but when you see a boy in the flesh, as opposed to seeing them on tape, it's a different thing entirely. The interviewer then stated, do you blame yourself? Edward responded, yes. The interviewer then asked, what do you hope will happen as a result of speaking out now? And Edward states, I hope that they go for the rest of their lives, and I hope that the boys who they killed, their families will know, and I hope maybe one day I'll find out what happened to the boy that Warwick was with that day. In the Guardian issue of April 1998, it was reported that as he approached the end of his 5-year sentence, Warwick Spinx was transferred from prison to that probation hostel in South London, where, like we said, he escaped. Warwick literally walked out of his probation hotel that escaped the country and eventually sent a postcard to his probation officer. A 2013 article by James Kirchick in The Spectator reported that not long after Warwick fled, he wound up in Prague, where a series of British newspapers reported he was running a tourism business for gay men, operating under the alias of Willem and posing as a Dutch national. The article mentioned that in August of 2012, after living in Prague for over 15 years, Warwick was arrested by the Czech police and extradited to the UK 2 months later. James went on to say that April, the one in which his article was published, he received a message from a friend in Prague telling him that they had spotted Willem hanging out around a notorious gay hustler bar. His friend went on to say that Willem, or Warwick, had been in Prague since March, and that his rental service he ran prior to his arrest was called Toucan Apartments, and had registered a Facebook page on April 12th of that year. Upon receiving this information from a friend, James called several British government agencies attempting to get an answer as to how a convicted, violent pedophile who had previously violated the terms of his probation and was on the run for 15 years could have been released after having served less than half of his remaining sentence. But he didn't get a clear answer from any official, and was repeatedly told that even the most basic information about Warwick Spinx, such as his release date or the prison he had been at, was unavailable to the public. In a Google search, we attempted to find the statistics of exactly how many children in the UK and Denmark were sexually abused in the year 2023 alone, highlighting the current happenings of a dark world. NSPCC Learning said that we don't know exactly how many children in the UK experienced sexual abuse. However, with research with 2,275 young people aged 11 to 17 about their experiences with sexual abuse, it suggested that 1 in 20 children in the UK have been sexually abused. According to Statista, in Denmark, there were only 276 sexual offenses against children reported. So, yeah, there is no resolution to this story. Warwick Spinx was able to get away with all of this. All these people, Harry Jeffries, Peter, these people that were running this ring got away with it. The men who bought these snuff films got away with it. The men who murdered these children on camera in these snuff films got away with it. And this whole gigantic pedophile ring remains unbusted to this day, with Warwick Spinx never revealing the truth about exactly what happened. I mean, it's very clear that this guy was a puppet master, and he admitted on camera, secret recordings, that he was involved in the production of these snuff films. I think that there was some really high profile, powerful people involved, and this story gets really, really deep. I could have done a 3-hour long episode here, but this is just a really, really important story that people need to be aware of. Thank you guys for listening today. I know this was a really dark and disturbing one, but I appreciate every single one of you so much. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for helping me to expose these creeps and these predators, because only through knowledge, through us learning about this stuff and, for my part, me talking about it here, that's the only way that we can actually stop something. So the more people that wake up and realize not only did this happen and it's very clear that it's happened and it has been exposed, but it's happening right now and we can try to stop it, the more people we can wake up to that fact, the better. But yeah, it's Colin here. Thank you guys for listening. I will see you guys next week. I love every single one of you that's out there watching and listening. Keep those tinfoil hats on and stay suspicious.